talking about two-way movement of the renminbi. Recently, it depreciated a lot, and people start to worry about the housing bubble could go bust.
I don't look for a precipitous bursting of a Chinese property bubble. I don't think there is a nationwide property bubble in China.
What about the 3.8 trillion US dollars stock of the foreign exchange?
I would think that you're getting closer to the time when the official level of foreign exchange reserves will be nearing a peak. Whether that peak is 4 trillion or 4.5 trillion, no one knows. But the rate of accumulation of foreign exchange reserves is likely to start slowing and start slowing soon.
我今天要采访的是史蒂芬·罗奇，他是前摩根士丹利亚洲区总裁，那么现在是耶鲁大学的教授。那么采访他呢，其实出于几个考虑。第一，他是比较了解中国和美国的宏观经济学家，那么一直被誉为是华尔街上的中国通，而且他对这个美国的政策呢也有影响。那么在08-09年中美汇率战比较严重的时候呢，实际上就是他代表产业、代表这种学术界去国会山进行听证的。那么另外一点呢，其实是他最近写了一本书，叫做《不平衡：中美之间的相互依赖》。那么在这本书里呢，其实他就描述了一个最差的场景，那么就是中美如果都不去努力、去改革、去进行再平衡的话，那么很有可能在经济、在产业、在文化、在政治很多方面呢，有可能出现一个非常坏的情景，就是走向对抗。那么他提出这样一个观点呢，实际上也是在提醒两国的决策者，就是说再平衡的进程一定要推行下去。那么经济改革和结构调整是一个绕不过去，也一定要完成的工作。Talking about two-way movement of the renminbi, recently it depreciated a lot, and people start to worry about the housing bubble could go bust. Do you see there the risk of that?
Well, first of all, the renminbi has not depreciated a lot. I mean, it's come down, 2% this year after having risen...
In 2 months.
Yeah, but 2% after having risen 35, 36%, you have to put it in perspective. I'm not a big believer that there's a massive nationwide housing bubble in China that's about to burst. I know many people are, but I think that, and while there have been speculative problems in some first-tier property markets in China, the broad support of housing demand through rural-urban migration really separates China from any other country in terms of looking at the demand side of housing market and residential construction activity. So I think that given the plans for urbanization that were unveiled a week ago, and the likelihood of at least 100 million new Chinese people moving into the cities and needing homes, needing shelter, needing apartments. I don't look for a precipitous bursting of a Chinese property bubble. I don't think there is a nationwide property bubble in China.
The Economist had this article just in its latest issue saying that,
look, The Economist is a great magazine, but they've been talking about housing bubbles in China for as long as The Economist has been in print. I mean, one of these decades they'll get it right. This is not that decade.
Right now, actually, here there's a big debate about how much the PBOC should intervene the internet money market or to regulate them. I was wondering why the United States has never opened up that sector, and what kind of international experiences should we learn?
I think this is all very new, and I don't really profess to have any real insights or expertise in internet banking. I know this has become a big deal recently in China with Alipay and Alibaba. There's a tremendous amount of transactions base liquidity that flows through the Alibaba system that can be marshaled in the form of deposits and dressed up as a quasi-bank. I think the regulators are comfortable with the transactions piece of the Alibaba platform, and certainly want to make certain that there's no speculative elements that then get brought into the picture that could suffer problems because of inadequate risk management practices of those charged with running the financial arrangements at Alipay.
You were talking in your book that the United States should change this situation of hollowing out of the manufacturing base, and the United States should, say, like export more high-end machineries to China as a part of the rebalancing process. Do you see the U.S. has a structural unemployment problem? Do you see the gap could be filled by new, staff and talents?
America needs a growth agenda. We don't do a 5-year plan like China. We don't have a third plenum where we debate policy. We don't really even have a process by which we set the priorities of economic management. But the one thing I feel very strongly about is that we're not going to be able to sustain our high levels of economic development in the United States if we do not begin to save again. China saves too much, we save too little. The answer is probably somewhere in between for both. But where China's savings rate is over 50%, our savings rate is under 15% in the United States. And you take away the saving that goes toward depreciation, the wear and tear of the capital stock, our savings rate now is only slightly positive. And if we could save again, whether it was reducing budget deficits or getting families to save again, we could recycle that saving into investment in human capital, physical capital, infrastructure, rebuild our competitiveness agenda, and then, yes, turn to exports of goods as well as services to countries like China that have extraordinary opportunities opening up in the potential expansion of domestic demand. We need to view China as an opportunity for a new growth agenda in America, not as a threat to our old growth agenda.
That also needs China to open up more.
In China, yeah, we need to negotiate very hard with China on being able to have access to domestic consumer product and services markets to allow our companies to participate in this bonanza of Chinese consumption.
You seem optimistic about China's rebalancing, while not so optimistic on the United States. Why? Why is that?
I think that China has been debating the strategy to shift the model for 7 years. And the 12th five-year plan was enacted 3 years ago to lay out the broad framework. And more recently, we've had the 60 articles of reform in the third plenum to really add specificity to the strategy. So China is making progress in terms of the concept as well as the implementation. Last year, for example, the services sector in China, tertiary sector, was larger than the combined manufacturing and construction sectors for the first time ever. This is the type of progress that China needs to continue on the road to rebalancing. And I'm very encouraged that these are positive steps in the right direction. The U.S. wants to go back to the ways it's always grown, which is heavy reliance on consumption, not much saving, and using policy tools, especially monetary policy, to squeeze more consumption out of asset markets. And I think that's a recipe that is dangerous and could end in another crisis for the United States. So China's making progress. America's trying to do it the same old way, and I don't think that's going to work over the long haul.
Mm-hmm. Talking about current account surplus, last year the ratio to GDP dropped down to 2.1%. Do you think this is this is a new norm, or?
I don't know if it's going to stay at 2%. I think a lot of the international organizations like the IMF are forecasting it to go back to maybe 3 to 4%. I think as China, though, moves down the road of rebalancing its economy with the share of GDP going to internal private consumption rising and the safety net becoming more secure for Chinese families, I think the current account surplus will stay much lower than it has been in recent years. Whether it goes down further from 2 or goes back up to 4 is hard to say, but I think the days of really large current account surpluses in China are now hopefully over.
What about the 3.8 trillion US dollars stock of the foreign exchange?
There's been a huge buildup of foreign exchange reserves again in China, and I think it reflects a couple of things. One, still the large current account surplus, even though it's come down, China still has the largest current account surplus in the world. And secondly, the belief that the renminbi would continue to appreciate. And the People's Bank of China sent a pretty strong signal earlier this year that it's now a two-way trade in the renminbi, and I think that will do a lot to dampen the speculative inflows into the renminbi that have led to significant further accumulation of foreign exchange reserves. I would think that you're getting closer to the time when the official level of foreign exchange reserves will be nearing a peak. Whether that peak is 4 trillion or 4.5 trillion, no one knows. But the rate of accumulation of foreign exchange reserves is likely to start slowing and start slowing soon.
Talking about managing these foreign exchange reserves, China in the past considered, say, like diversification of its holdings, diverting from the U.S. dollars and other assets. It has been always a headache. What's your suggestion on that aspect?
Well, look, I'll leave that up to China's currency managers. They continue to have a large overweight in dollar-based assets, 1.3 trillion in treasuries, and probably, we don't know this for sure, but an educated guess is another 700 billion in the agency debt of Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. That's a big overweight. The overweight, though, reflects the fact that the renminbi has been tightly managed relative to the dollar. Were it not for those purchases of dollar-based assets, the renminbi most likely would have gone up sharply higher. As now the PBOC is a little bit more relaxed in terms of the two-way trading renminbi versus the dollar, it's quite possible that they could begin to cut back purchases of dollar-based assets and let the currency fall out more naturally, trading to the downside rather than continuing to limit it to the upside.
I think in the book you warn about if China and U.S. go awry on things could go very, very bad. But in the past we have already had a lot of disputes on IP, on exchange rate, on trades. Why we cannot keep things that way without,
The odds are that things will not get out of hand between the United States and China. That we will, from time to time, depending on the political cycle, talk tough, but not break out into open economic and trade wars. But I wrote in the book about a scenario that describes a full-blown trade war between China and the United States, just to make the point to the readers that you can't ever say nothing can happen. You have to go through in your mind and think about the worst case scenario and use that description of events as a reason to make certain that it never happens again. So that was the purpose of writing what I called this bad dream, was to describe in great detail what an outbreak of hostilities between the U.S. and China might look like, what it might mean to both economies, which would be devastating, and what it might mean to the world economy.
So that's a deterrent so that both countries can change.
I hope it is, but again, in the United States, with really high levels of unemployment, that puts a lot of pressure on politicians, and politicians don't know how to fix things like unemployment. It's easier for them to blame others, other countries like China, for the problems of America's workers. So from time to time, we've had legislation introduced in the U.S. Congress that would put big tariffs on everything China sells into the U.S. The bills, one bill passed the House, one bill passed the Senate, but no bills passed both in the same year, and yet you really can't rule that out, as much as I'd like to, as a risk factor to keep in the back of your mind and think about, that if the labor market still stays tough and there are political pressures, it's still a possibility. It's remote, but it's still a possibility.
So after this crisis, do you see a trend of, say, like deglobalization?
I think that there are some aspects that of this post-crisis period that are drawing into question the vigor of, say, global trade as an arena for an exchange of goods and services between nations. The global trade share of GDP recouped the decline of 2009, but it hasn't grown. So it's really been flat now for going on 5 years. And that follows an extraordinary surge beginning in the early 2000s when China joined WTO. The growth in global exports has been more than cut in half. Is this deglobalization, or is this just weaker global growth? Probably a combination of the two.
那么罗奇呢，其实他还是坚持自己一贯的观点，那么就是中美都需要调整，而且两个国家呢都是利益攸关者。那么此外呢，在这个采访当中，他还提到了对新经济的看法，对于中国房地产市场的看法，我觉得这些还值得我们一读。